And I've seen historians put down the fact in the legends that years ago the Sioux cut the throats of their enemies. Well, maybe they did and maybe they didn't. They might cut anybody's throat, you know, or any tribe might. But it is plausible to believe that when these Indians meet this Sioux coming out, they say, "How do you speak that new fellow that's come out here on the plains?" Well, they look at him, and what's the most characteristic thing about him? He wears that necklace. And my way of thinking, that is the way that sign came about. But that is your Sioux sign. Now that's the sign for, well, for all the Sioux. A man that's a Sioux is a Sioux. The different branches of the Sioux have the different names for them. For instance, you take your Assiniboine, who's way up north. Now he's a branch of the Sioux, but he's lived up north among those very close to the, well, to the Gros Ventres and the Blackfeet, and he's taken on all of their customs. He's taken on their way of dressing the hair. So that he's still a Sioux, but they call him a false Sioux. Now, you've heard of the forked tongue. Well, that's how that sign is. 2 fingers sideways from the mouth. Forked tongue. That also means false. He's a Sioux, but he's a false Sioux. Now you get over to his neighbors, the Blackfeet, and because years ago when the tribes had split up, when the buffalo was scarce one year, and they had split the Blackfoot is really a pagan, and the pagan sign is this way. Very often they'll say that it was because, someone will say it's the way they painted their face, and others that they were bad tanners. They lived far in the north, and it was a cold country, and the squaws didn't tan the hides very well, and that there were blue spots in the hide. And that was the idea, that there were rough spots in the hide. So that is the pagan. So when the pagans split up, now you see, people are together, run parallel. This is the idea of being the same or parallel, with the fingers one alongside the other and move them forward, means you're parallel, you're the same. They are the same people. But when they had split up, they came back. When they came back, and now this is to meet. You meet, you come face to face. And when they came back, now to arrive at a place, if it's one person, if I say I'm going to come to this place, I arrive here. But if it's a great number of people, just all the fingers extended and bring the hands together that way. So when they came back, this particular band had walked, now to walk, you see, is this way. They'd walked across country. Now here's your prairie. This is your whole country, as they'd say. They'd walked across this prairie. It had been all burned over. Now that's the sign for fire. Fire blazes up, as you can see. It had blazed up, there had been fire, the country was burned over, but it now was nothing but ashes. So you make the sign for fire, and by rubbing your hands of the left hand over the tips of the right, that means ashes or soot. So they walked over this country that was all ashes and soot. And their moccasins, now your moccasin, you would take your hand that way and just toward your foot, you see? That's your moccasin down there. The moccasins were black. So the chief gave them, as I showed you a moment ago, if you give something to a man, they gave them the name. They spoke that of Blackfeet. Now this other group of Indians who had split off that pagan tribe had come through a country that was filled with berry patches. Now grass is down here. Bushes are up here. If you speak of trees, you extend all the fingers, you see. That's trees, and just pull it back. Trees, bushes, grass. So they had walked through a country that these berry patches. Now, that would be ordinary bushes, but if they had the little berries that you can pick off the tops of them, it means a berry patch. And they had eaten these berries, and their faces were all smeared. And it looked like blood. Now blood, the sign for blood, comes from the nose. That's their idea. Blood, parallel, as I showed you a moment ago, the same, it looked like. So it looked like blood, but it was all over their faces, particularly around the lips. And the way they make the sign for those Indians today is with the finger drawn right across the lips that way. They've done away with all the, takes a half a dozen signs to say blood looks like here. So they just use that sign for the blood Indians, who are still part of the Pagans, but they live over on the other side of the Canadian border. Now, your Canadian border is indicated. It's a line, it's the boundary. Now, sometimes the Indian would say, in that country, but the boundary line, it has monuments along it, you know, marking the big stone monuments, all scattered along across the border. And they'd say, that line with the monuments on it, the other side, you see anything that's on that side, you hold your left hand up this way, and with the right, you indicate the other side. Now, if it's this side, you bring it toward you. So it's other side, this side. So they say, that line with the monuments, the other side of these bloods, they sit down. They stay there. Now, this is to sit down, to rise is to come up this way. And that, of course, is how some of those signs, as I say, have evolved. Now, with a number of those tribes, you know, there's a very funny thing about these Indian names that we have. The names of half of our Western Indians, especially in the north, you'll find have a French derivation. Some of the Indians can't pronounce their own name. And they have been given them by the French, because the French voyageurs, the old trappers, the courriers de bois, as they call them, were way out in the western country long before the Americans went out there. We didn't get into that country until the days of Lewis and Clark in 1804, whereas way back in the 1700s, the early 1700s, and in the 1600s, the French were coming out under Champlain, under the Vérendrye in 1732, 33, 34. So they were way out ahead of the Americans. Therefore, they gave French names to a lot of the, not only the locales, but to the Indian tribes. And your name's Sioux. The Sioux does not call himself Sioux. He's the Sioux, this fellow that I told you about with the necklace. He calls himself Lakota. Now, the three different branches of the Sioux, your Ogallala Sioux, which has that great L sound, calls himself Lakota. Whereas, go a little farther north, and you get the name that we have for the states, Dakota. Everything then is the D sound. Go farther up to this fellow that I told you about was the false Sioux, the Assiniboine. He calls himself Nakota. So with the exception of the Assiniboine, you use that same sign for the Sioux. But the Sioux, as I say, that's what he calls himself. But the derivation, I think, of this word Sioux, it was originally a corruption of French and Chippewa mixed together, and it was called Addewissu. So it was shortened to Sioux. Now, your Cheyenne Indians, now the sign for your Cheyenne Indian is this way. They call them the men of many scars, because years ago, the Cheyennes had marks. They scarred their forearms and also their thigh, and they wore these scars. So they called them the men of many scars. So it's simpler in signs, instead of going over the arms and down around the thigh, just to say this way. There are the scars of the Cheyennes. Now the Cheyenne, he doesn't call him Cheyenne at all. It's a derivation, again, of a corruption of French from the word dog, Shan. And from Shan, it became Cheyenne. Now, I don't know whether some of them have said because the Cheyennes were probably dog eaters. Well, the Arapaho could beat the Cheyenne eating dogs anytime, because they were among the tribes, they were known as the dog eaters. Now, the sign for that Arapaho is like this, tattooed on the chest, because years ago, they drew a pattern, drew these circles, dots, whatever pattern they wanted to tattoo. Then, in order to tattoo, they would bind together a bunch of porcupine quills or the needles from the prickly pear, which is a species of cactus, and then after they'd drawn this design, pounded into the chest with those fine needle points, you know, just the same as we tattoo today. Now, a strange thing about that, that would turn blue. Well, it's just the same as a powder burn. I've got powder burns in my ear and down the back of my neck here where an Indian shot at me one time, quite inadvertently, didn't mean it. But I just turned my head away, missed me, and I have those powder burns still in my ear and back of my neck, and you'll see it in coal miners today. Very often, with these coal miners who have, where their pick has knocked out little chunks of coal, put in their face, once it's embedded under the skin, it takes on a blue cast, you know? Now, this blue cast is what was on these Arapahoes' chests. Now, the Arapaho, he can't even say Arapaho because he can't pronounce that R. So we tried to trace it down. General Scott and I have worked on this for a long time, and Scott's contention was that it was a Crow word, because in the Crow language they have that R sound. The Crow doesn't call himself Crow, he calls himself Apsaruka. So you get that rolling R. The name for a woman, Merikata. It's a very round R sound. So General Scott figured out that there is a Crow word called Arapush, which means sky blue. So seeing those tattoo signs on the Arapahoes, they called them the sky blue men, but they still use this particular sign for those Arapahoes. Now, on this Wind River that I was speaking about, where we used to run cattle, and where I really got indoctrinated into sign language, we had the two tribes. We had this Arapaho. Now, the Arapaho, as I said, he can't say his own name. He can't say Arapaho. He calls himself Hananahai. I'll try to figure that one out. Has nothing to do with his Arapaho. So I'll try to show you how the names came to these different tribes. Now, the French, of course, they have given, well, you take up here, we have a tribe called the Nez Perce, or the Nez Perce, which is nothing more than a corruption of the French word, French words, ne piercer, to pierce the nose. And that's the sign for that Nez Perce Indian, because years and years ago, all the way back into antiquity, they wore an ornament in the nose, so that they had pierced the nose the same as they pierced the ears for their ornaments. So when the Indians meeting them, gave them a name. They called them the fellows who pierced their nose. Now, the French also, there's another tribe up there called the Pandoré, which is French. Big earrings. And that is the sign for them. It's easier in the sign than it is to hear the word pronounced. So the Pandoré, he's got the big earrings. They're hung down, way down here, like that. Now, your Shoshone, as I was saying a moment ago, you had your Arapaho on the reservation, you also had your Shoshone. Now, your Shoshone is called the Snake Indian. The right hand is lifted this way with the index finger pointed out straight, and then make the movement like a snake crawling forward. And it wasn't because they were snakes, but that they had lived along the Snake River. Now, they would say the Snake River. Now, as I showed you a moment ago, you say water, water in a line is a river, so you'd say water in a line, the river, Snake River. Now, another use of that particular snake sign is among your Comanches, who are way down in the Indian Territory, down in Oklahoma. That is the sign for your Comanche because he really was a Shoshone at one time. Now, on the same reservation with him, just as we have the Arapaho and the Shoshone up on Wind River, and by the way, this Wind River, you have to know something about, here's another thing about talking signs. You've got to know something about the Indians named for these different geographical locations. Now, your Wind River is really your Bighorn River. And the Bighorn is the mountain sheep, because that river wound its way up through the Bighorn Mountains, and they had called them, now mountain is up here. Now, this is a sign for anything that's firm and hard. If it's a rock, it's like that. If it's a ridge or mountain, It's up there. We're up there in the mountains. Now the bighorn sheep, you know, those big curling horns, that's the way they made the sign for him. So that's how the Bighorn River got its name, because of the mountain sheep in the Bighorn Mountains. The strange thing about that Wind River, it rises clear up in Yellowstone Park and flows south, comes around the spur of the mountain like a horseshoe, and then flows north until it empties into the Yellowstone. Now the Yellowstone, the Indian doesn't call that the Yellowstone River. He calls it the Elk River. The Elk River. Now the Little Bighorn, you've all heard of the Little Bighorn on the Custer, was a tributary of the Bighorn. But the Indian didn't call it the Little Bighorn. He called it the Greasy Grass. Now the idea of greasy is like a slab of bacon that was first given them. Bacon in those days didn't come as it does in the supermarkets today, all sliced. You got the bacon in a great big slab and cut it to suit yourself. The bacon rind, big old Osage chief by the name of Bacon Rind. We used to use the bacon rind, you know, to grease the skillets to cook your hotcakes on. But bacon is greasy. So when they speak of the Little Bighorn, an Indian who knows his stuff doesn't say the Little Bighorn. To say it, you'd say River, Bighorn, Little. Now you see, that's little, that's big. Big, and that's little. Now they wouldn't have to say Bighorn, they'd just make the sign for that Bighorn sheep, you see. But instead of going through all those signs to say Little Bighorn, they merely said that stream, this is the Greasy Grass. Greasy grass, as I showed you, is down here. Greasy grass, and that's what they call the Little Horn River, or the Little Bighorn, as we say. Now, I was showing you about this Comanche sign a moment ago. Down on that reservation in the south, you've got the Kiowas and Comanches on the same reservation, the same as you have the Arapaho and the Shoshone up here. I've seen a number of signs for that Kiowa, but the best one, and the one I like best, is the one that's used down there, because they're both together, but they want to differentiate. So your Comanche, as I say, is like the snake, and they make the snake going backward for the Kiowa. So you've got Comanche and Kiowa. Now, all these other Indians down there, the Plains Indian didn't bother to give separate names to all of those different tribes who were down in the Indian Territory. So he would refer to them merely as those Indians who live on the other side of the Arkansas River, which is the Indian Territory. Now they don't call that the Arkansas River. They call it the Flint River, meaning the flint and steel. You take one hand, compress the fingers as though you were holding your piece of flint, and then in the other hand you take your steel and you strike it to make a spark. So they'd say river, flint, the other side of it. That's the Indian Territory, down the other side of the Flint River. Now, any number of these tribes that I speak of, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Assiniboine, the Arapaho, Shoshone, Comanche, Kiowa, the Pawnee, for instance, they were called the Wolf people. Now, that is the sign for the coyote or the wolf. I think I mentioned that to you a moment ago. Smart. So they called those Pawnees the Wolf Indians. You would also use that sign if you want to say a man is pretty smart. He's got smart. He's got a heap of smart, as the Indian would say. And then if a man is particularly bright and very cunning, you get into their idioms. They say, you know, he's smart, he leads a coyote. Well, now a man's got to be pretty smart to lead a coyote, you know. So you make the sign for the coyote, and as though you had a rope in your hand, and we're leading him along like that, and that in their idiomatic language, let's say, is the fact that this man is pretty shrewd and pretty clever. Look out, he leads a coyote. And they have a sense of humor on those things, you know. A lot of their signs are made that way. Now, these different tribes, as I say, except your Pawnee with your wolf, but you get down to your Osage and these other people, and they called them the shavehead people, because those southern Indians, like your Sac and Fox, your Osage, Wichita, any of those Indians that lived down in that country, all shaved their head like the Iroquois. A few years ago, there was a great fad among the kids. You remember the Mohawk haircut, where they just wore their roach and then shaved both sides of the head? Well, all those Indians were shaved head Indians. And I think your Osage is the fellow who's kept it last of all. And they take the hands, turn the back of the hand as closely as you can to the head, and draw it in a backward motion right across your head as though you were shaving both sides of the head. And that sign covers most of those Indians in the South. Well, you know, you fuss around with these Indians and their names, their derivation of the names, where they lived, what they did. But what we're dealing with mostly is your Plains Indian. Now, the Plains Indian, as I say, he was a nomad. He depended on the buffalo for his livelihood. And when the Great Spirit gave the buffalo to the Indian, he gave him the greatest package deal that was ever given to any people. Well, I'll just take, for instance, he killed the buffalo. Now, to kill is this way. You just kill it. That sign can be used in any number of ways to kill something. If winter can kill, or if you're talking about starving to death or killing yourself, as I showed you a moment ago, that means to eat. But by taking the right hand and taking the back of the hand and cutting it across the stomach this way, it's as though you had a knife cutting your stomach. You're hungry. You're starving. You're hungry. Now, if through hunger you turn that kill sign around towards yourself, it means you starve to death. So he would kill the buffalo. Now they'd cut that meat up. You see, here's the sign to cut. Hold it up as though you had this big chunk of meat. He'd cut it up, dress the meat. Now a certain amount of it was eaten at the time, and the rest, as I say, was cut up, but hung up to dry. Now this means hanging it up on those frames that they make and let the sun cure it. Or they could, they'd rub it with salt. But the sun really dehydrates it, so that after a while that meat was hanging around in all the villages. Heavens, you could shoot an arrow against it and couldn't hit it. You know, it couldn't penetrate it. It was just, you couldn't bother with it at all. The thing was just like a piece of sole leather. But when they took that and they'd take a mortar and grind it up. Now there's the sign for grinding up your meat. So they would take that meat, grind it all up. Then with that, they made a powder, of course. They would take the marrow out of the bone, take that out of the bone, mix that in. Now to mix, you see, they just mix it around this way. You hold that as over an object or a vessel, and then mix it all up in there. Then they would take the bladder of the buffalo, or the stomach, and then fill that full of that pemmican that they had just made. Now to make work, you use that work sign to make anything. And they would fill that, tie it up. That's why you have to use a certain amount of pantomime with your sign. You can make the sign, but then you elaborate a little of the little pantomime. Tie it up and put it away. You lay it down, put it away, so that a head. Now time, you say that is a head, and this is behind. So anything in the future is out there. So a head, let's say, in the winter. Now winter means that's cold, congeals, you know. So in the winter, when the snow is falling, it's piled up to there. In the teepee, we can sit down and eat, and everything is fine. Now, that was your meat of your buffalo. Now they took the hooves and they boiled them and made glue. Now your glue, let's take the arrow. Now one way to indicate the arrow is taking it out of the quiver. And they hold it up. And then they drop this glue on it and wrap it and make an arrow. So there's your glue. The horns, they smoothed out, made utensils, You've heard of that old expression, the great horn spoon? Well, they made great spoons out of those horns. They used them for certain vessels, and then they used